for most people on Earth, responsibility is the incorrect attribution of things that justify unhappiness in life and unhappiness that we are willing to hand out based on our belief that people had control over things that which they did not. That's most of the human experience.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Unlikely Collaborators. Their mission is to untangle the stories that hold us back as individuals, communities, nations, and humanity at large. Using the perception box lens, they do this through storytelling, experiences, impact, investments, and scientific research. Unlikely Collaborators, the only way forward is inward. Later on in this episode, I'll talk a lot more about the perception box and how it relates to this episode. But right now, let me tell you about today's guest. Today we welcome Robert Sapolsky to the show. Robert is professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University and a research associate with the Institute of Primate Research at the National Museum of Kenya. His research has been featured in the National Geographic documentary Stress: Portrait of a Killer. At age 30, Robert received the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Grant. He is author of Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, A Primate's Memoir, The Trouble with Testosterone, and Monkeyluv. His latest book is called Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. In this episode, I talked to Robert Sapolsky about life without free will. Humans like the idea of having control over their lives, but Robert asserts that free will is just an illusion. Robert argues that life beyond free will may sound unpleasant, but explains the profound consequences of this belief in reforming the justice system, meritocracy, and education. We also touch on the topics of philosophy, quantum physics, mindfulness, grit, and responsibility. Wow, this was such an incredibly exciting conversation with one of my intellectual heroes, and just being able to chat with him and freestyle and arm wrestle a little bit about the nature of free will was very exciting for me. Even though we have different definitions of free will, as you'll see when you listen to this conversation, we don't agree on everything. I really have the deepest amount of respect for him, and I encourage you to weigh in on your own thoughts on this conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. This is a really important topic, and whatever your belief on it, I think that this topic needs to be supported by evidence and logic. So without further ado, I bring you this really stimulating and enriching conversation with Robert Sapolsky. Well, I've really been looking forward to this for a long time, this chat, and
Thanks.
as a fellow cognitive scientist, I feel like we can really nerd out today. This is not going to, this doesn't have to be like, a media interview where they just ask the questions and you answer them. I bet you'd like a break from that. Anyway, so I wanted to start off by understanding a little bit about your own, the own links in the causal chain that led up to you even being interested in free will to begin with.
Well, I think I mentioned somewhere in the book, yeah, I do. I was 14 when I decided that none of this made any sense. I had, early adolescence, some sort of angsty crisis of things converging and turmoil and tumult and all that. And one night I woke up like at 2 a.m. and I said, oh, I get it. That's why there's no God. And then like shortly after that, and there's no free will. And it's a totally empty and different universe. So that kind of came in this epiphanal moment. So I've been quite convinced of this ever since. And I realized sort of for the book, I discovered some of the notes I was vaguely referring to I had taken in college. So I've been like thinking about this stuff for a long time.
You have, and you got interested in biology for a reason as well. What do you think really attracted you to that level of analysis?
There, I'm going to diverge from that a bit, and that I think it was just purely emotional. My mother took me to the Museum of Natural History in New York all the time. And like we went into the primate exhibit and something just clicked, something just imprinted. This famous stuffed mountain gorilla there who was shot by some grand old naturalist in 1912 and stuffed. It was just something emotional. It just resonated. I want to live inside those dioramas. So it was only sort of by college that kind of the scientific bits and pieces for it began to fall into place.
Beautiful. Well, I've been a longtime follower of your work, and I show your videos in my class at Columbia. I show this one video of you talking about dopamine, where you say, and there's no rat on earth that will press for an afterlife,
We're weird. We're a very weird species.
We are weird, which actually I think is a good segue into the topic of free will. You have this quote, which I think it summarizes the whole book. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that has brought us to any moment. And so do you think that leads to the conclusion that we have zero free will?
If having to edit for length, I had to turn that sentence to 4 words, it's completely obvious. There's no free will. I think maybe the fact that I'm kind of half neurobiologist and half primatologist. So the two different realms has had me, the primatology, I actually have to talk to ecologists now and then and evolutionary biologists, and the neuro people, like hanging with molecular biologists. I think I, as a result, sort of inadvertently stumbled into having a respect for more different disciplinary approaches to science stuff. And I think the critical point is, okay, a behavior has occurred. It's wonderful. It's awful. It's in between, blah, blah. Why did it happen? Which neurons just did that a second ago? That's good to figure out. But what sensory stimuli in the prior minute prompted those neurons, and what hormone levels this morning made that brain more or less sensitive to those stimuli? And what about previous 3 months? And were you traumatized or stimulated? And adolescence and childhood and fetal life and genes and culture and ecology and eventually evolution. And I think the key thing in there is that saying you've got to look at all of those is not because someone would study the literature on supposedly how, so you look at that and it's not just, whoa, I've just spent 14 years studying the behavior genetics. And you know what? Yeah, it influences, it modulates, it's all of that. But you sure can't say that it disproves free will, because there's this hole in the adoption studies, or you get somebody who's an endocrinologist, and you go through each of those. It's not that you could then say, ooh, somebody identifies a hole in one of these disciplinary approaches. But thank God ecologists could answer that. Or you don't believe that fetal environment does this or that, but sociologists have here that plugs the hole. That's not the point. The most critical point is, so you sit there, and the reason why you got to look at all these different disciplines is not because, each one has a fatal limitation, it's explanatory power, and you can't rule out free will just based on being an endocrinologist or just whatever. But whoa, the people who study this other field, they can plug that hole. So you get enough of these disciplines and we could plug all the holes. That's not the point. Overwhelmingly, the point is these are not all different disciplines. They're all one. By definition, if you're talking about genes, you're talking about evolution. And you're also talking about whatever proteins you made in your brain this morning. If you're talking about yesterday's hormone levels, you're also implicitly talking about what your fetal environment was when you were constructing your glands and how reactive. It's all one continuous set of influences. And when you look at that, it's just this one big, magnificent arc of environment and biology, blah, blah. When you look at it, there's not a damn crack anywhere in that arc that you can shoehorn in something happening that is independent of all that stuff.
Hmm.
That, in some ways, no, it's not a multidisciplinary approach. This is all the same thing, and there's no space in there.
Well, I think you did an excellent job in your book of taking down the magical free will argument that we somehow have some sort of magical free will. And I think that, that you did a really great job of that. And I think that there are certain compatibilists who needed to hear that for sure. I think I'm a flavor of compatibilist that still, that's on board with you, but I also think that there's multiple ways to define the term free will. Yeah, I'm a little more flexible in how we
Okay,
define. Yeah,
let's go at it
yeah.
then.
Yeah, no.
What's your definition?
Well, the first thing I have a question about, and this is really just for my sake of understanding, not fighting, but understanding, for us to understand each other. Who is the we? There feels like a little bit of like a crypto dualism in here. If we are look, both of us can agree that we are biological organisms, but as a biologist, don't you agree that we're biological control systems? And is not the whole purpose of biological control systems feedback and homeostasis in organisms to control their survival and reproduction?
Oh, absolutely.
So then, yes. Okay, good. Okay, we're there.
Yeah,
We agree there. Okay,
yeah.
let's keep going. If we are nothing more than our brain processes, we're prediction machines. We are goal-directed machines. So we do have some innately built goal directions that are not completely influenced by external constraints. I suppose that your perspective seems to me like a very, and tell me how I'm wrong, but it feels to me like a very behaviorist sort of interpretation of the we part.
Well, the we is somewhere between like almost acceptable metaphor and tongue in cheek. Like all the like if you're a sociobiologist or evolutionary psychologist, you'll be sitting there saying, okay, so what does a prairie vole want to do at that point in this circumstance? And then they like feel obliged to say, of course, when we say what does the prairie vole want, it doesn't actually want it, but over the course of evolution, it's been sculpted by exigencies of selection, and that this is not a conscious process. We're just using it as a shorthand. And when you really unpack it, we, me, I, is just as much of a shorthand, because it would be a pain in the neck at that point to instead say, well, when I say me, I actually mean the concatenation of gene environment nonlinear thing. It's a shorthand. There's no me in there that's anything more than like the emergent outcome of all the little pieces there. And it rarely makes sense anymore to try to understand me-ness by just looking at the little constituent parts, but that's all it's made of.
When you look at what humans want out of free will, I think we have it. I think the magical free will thing confuses people sometimes. Human biological organisms really care about their ability to change goals, to change. You definitely talk about change, and we'll get to that. They want to be able to make decisions. They want to feel like they have some sense of choice. The idea of choice in your model is also is really interesting, because the question is, how do you define the word choice? What's your working definition of choice? Let's start there so we can be on the same terms.
Okay, just to be like totally in your face, choice is the erroneous belief that you were the agent
oh my gosh.
of
Okay.
Change in your behavior and or taste just now. Because, okay, evolution. So we're just going to live in that bucket for a while here. What's the job of all organisms? It's the drive towards reproduction, individual selection, passing copies of their genes, and that's just like innate. It's fundamental. I mean, that like vines are thinking that way when they're strangling fig trees or something. They just want to have more babies and have that. Well, this is just innate. But then you get like people in the Shakers who went extinct because they all chose to be celibate. Or like Oh, but don't forget kin selection. You can also maximize your reproductive success by also investing in the reproductive success of your relatives as a function of their degree of relatedness. And that's why, like, plants cooperate with each other based on like surface proteins and their degree of relatedness reflected in that. And that's why baboons, all they think about is, are you like my cousin or not? And that's us. That's, can you, kinship terms, like all anthropologists have been doing for centuries, are kinship terms, because that's just like giving the cultural frosting on your evolutionary innateness. And then you get somebody who adopts a kid from the other side of the planet. And that just goes down the tube. So the notion that, well, I think what we've just, what I just inadvertently did was go through, there's the hole, and anyone who says evolution of behavior disproves free will. Yeah,
Yeah.
those are holes. No, you're absolutely right.
You also, I mean, you admitted earlier that, it was actually an interesting segue in the beginning because we talked about, rat lever presses and how there is something uniquely human about human decision making. You admitted that, like humans are, don't you think that human organisms are decision making machines? And do you not think that an organism is a causal nexus where at least some of the fully causally determined processes can reasonably be described as choices, at least? But it sounds like you're saying no.
No, no.
No.
I mean,
Okay.
if a ball rolls down a hill as a result of it, all of the molecules inside it are turning over and over and over. Wow, look at that causality.
But we have a lot built in. That's a very behaviorist sort of way of treating humans.
Well,
We're not a black box. We're not a black box.
no. And in fact, the more we open up the black box, the more clearly we can see the gears in a way where, like, Descartes goes out the window with anything about like organisms as machines, but gears like enough to get 30,000 people show up Society for Neuroscience meeting each year because they're so intent on how complicated the damn gears are. And that's not even talking to like the political scientists but yeah, all that opening up the black box does is show the mechanisms. And what it also shows is the power of stuff that we never even suspected was there. And on a certain level, the last 500 years of Western culture could be described as people saying over and over, wow, I had no idea biology had something to do with that. I mean, that's a little bit of a monomaniacal way of looking at human history, but that we've just been learning that over and over and over. And somewhere in there, you look at the deceptions and self-deceptions with which the world has worked in the past until people figured out, oh, I had no idea biology had something to do with it. And we've done that. We're doing it right now, looking at, people with a certain variant of the leptin gene. No matter how damn much they want to will themselves to have willpower, they're going to be obese, as has been every member of their family. And we sit there and then attribute agency and choice when it's just mechanism. I think what runs through all this, and the sense that an awful lot of the compatibilist philosophers, when you really read closely what they're saying is, oh God, there better be free will, because what a bummer it's going to be otherwise. So this is why there's free will. I'm being snarky there, but when you consider how much all of us operate on that, there's an entire literature in evolutionary biology about the evolution of our capacity for self-deception, because like reality is quite a drag sometimes.
And I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think that it's totally fair. By the way, everyone hearing the chainsaw massacre that's occurring right now, Just no, just go with it with us. Go. We hear it. Yes, we hear it. But
Yes.
we're safe. Robert's safe, right? You got some angry compatibilist out there
Right.
but I I'm not an angry compatibilist. I have a lot of sympathy for your project. It's one of those things where like, I'm with you, and then they're like the very last step, I'm like, not with you. Do you know what I mean? So I have a lot of sympathy for you saying, just you could have just simply said, we have a lot less control. So much of it's an illusion. The role of unconscious processes is so great, and even our conscious processes, we think we made those decisions. But to give us like no wiggle room whatsoever, that's the step. That's where we're zooming in here. That's what we're zooming in here. Yeah.
And you're right. Like if I'm trying to be a good dinner guest or something,
Right.
I'll do a whole lot less. And we really need to reform the criminal justice system. And it's really egregious that like 3/4 of my Stanford undergrads come from wealthy families, and like something's right. No, there's nothing there at all. And when you're saying that's the point where you say, no, I'm that way 99% of the time also. I constantly react in life as if I believe in agency and have a whole lot of faith in my own and have a lot of self-congratulatory instincts about my own sense of agency. But it's not the case. And every now and then I manage not to be a hypocrite. And it takes a lot of work, and it lasts for a few seconds before I lapse back into being a person of my place and time.
It's very interesting. Different people throughout the course of human history have come to different conclusions about, a lot of very smart people, have come to very different conclusions about this. William James, who I know that you've had bouts of depression. He had a lot of bouts of depression. He has the famous quote, "My first act of free will be to believe in free will." That's one of his famous quotes. Your dog likes your dogs. They like that. They like
they
that.
They love William James.
They must be big. They must be big William James fans.
They mostly just like the beard, very imprinted. Okay, Glenda. William James. Yes. Hooray for him. And all that's happened is it's become clearer, and just to really like put the earth on our shoulders weighing us down, all that has happened is a stronger and stronger moral imperative to act this way.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely get to all the implications for moral responsibility, etc. I want to stay on that initial assertion for a second before we get to all the implications. I am so excited to announce that registrations are now open for our self-actualization coaching intensive. While the coaching industry has taken great strides over the years toward integrating more evidence-based coaching approaches, there is still a lot of work to be done. Many coach training programs still lack strong foundations in science and do little to incorporate research-informed tools, methodologies, or approaches for helping clients thrive. For 20 years, I've dedicated my career to rigorously testing ways to unlock creativity, intelligence, and our potential as human beings. Now, for the first time ever, I have compiled some of my greatest insights to bring the new science of self-actualization to the field of professional coaching. This immersive 3-day learning experience will introduce you to self-actualization coaching, an approach intended to enhance your coaching practice by offering you evidence-based tools and insights from my research that will equip you to more effectively help your clients unlock their unique potential. Don't miss out on this unique opportunity. Join us and take your coaching practice to the next level. Go to sacoaching.org. That's sacoaching.org. I look forward to welcoming you in December. So what's wrong? Tell me what's wrong with saying that we, quote we, as a bunch of brain processes. See, it's funny. Some people might say you're being really reductionistic, but I would say you're not being reductionistic enough. Look, if all we are a bunch of brain processes that control, quote, ourselves as a physical organism, well, obviously the brain processes were influenced by their genes and an entire developmental history. I give that to you. But aren't they still the physical processes that are causally producing behavior in the present, even in the proximal link of the causal chain? Are you denying that?
No, of
Oh,
course that's
yay! I think
yay.
because this is why I say that, and I'm so glad that at least we can agree on that, because I think that's the kind of free will worth wanting, or that most people actually want.
Okay. But just to take the wind out of my agreeing, I'll then say,
Okay.
but that concedes nothing. I think what we've come into here are the different definitions of free will.
That's
And
right.
society is perfectly happy to function on some very proximal definitions of free will.
That's right.
All the legal system is built around is when that person did that, did they intend to? Did they understand what the consequences would be? And did they realize they had alternative options? And if the answer is like all of that, they intended to do it, it's guilty. And they even thought about it 3 seconds beforehand. So it's premeditated guilt. And all the people who have spent 40 years like futzing over Libet and the Libet experiments, what they're essentially asking is, science equivalent to the same courtroom one, which is when that person first decided they had an intent to do something, had their brain already decided, oh my God, let's fight over milliseconds and what our measurement assays can actually tell us with what resolution. And the problem in both cases is, I think, the metaphor I use in there in the book is that's reviewing a movie based on its last 3 minutes, because the courtroom and the Libet obsessives are never asking, where did that intent come from in the first place? Because that's ultimately the only question you can ask. Because if you really want to understand this human stuff, we've got to be able to explain not just why did this kid show up from Psych 101 and do this experiment for Libet and press the button, but why didn't they steal the laptop on the way out? Why weren't they in prison that day instead? Because they were like fetal alcohol syndrome. Why were they not able to do that? Because they were actually like in a village in Mauritania evading a warlord. Or where did that intent come from? And in some ways, I think what shows that, like, if you start with intent, you're missing at least 97% of it, is you can't wish for what you're going to wish for yet. And you can't intend to intend something, and you can't think of what you're going to think for yet, think next, and you can't will yourself to have more willpower. And all of those are more obscure ways of saying that's what intent is made of. And there's no volition in there in the slightest, because there's an explanation why the kid didn't steal the laptop or isn't dead in Somalia, and biological and environmental luck and everything that brought him to that moment.
But this is the thing. We can't get away from this like implicit crypto dualism, because I am the organism. So look, even if it, whatever the decision that has been made for me, that I think that I illusorily, it's not really an illusion, because like, can I take responsibility for the fact that I am the organism? I mean, there is a space that this takes up right here,
Well,
and that there are processes happening, and whatever decisions, that it is me. It's not part of me. It is me. It is me.
And that's fine if you want to define responsibility in the sense of like, I'm the person who caused the atoms making up this pillow to go from there to there. If you want to say the rolling ball is responsible for why all those little like molecules inside keep turning over and over and over and are getting like seasick, yeah, responsibility in this purely instrumental value-free way. But that's not how we use the word responsibility. We use it on deciding if somebody earns their corner office in their corporation, or if they earned their jail sentence, or if they earned on some level not having friends, or if it's responsibility that's just like marinated in judgment. And that's the type of responsibility that is so much worse than simply not making sense.
Yeah. I read a lot of Jeffrey Gray, the biologist's work. I don't know how familiar, you probably are quite familiar with Jeffrey Gray's work.
It's been a while, but yeah.
Like Creeping Up on the Hard Problem of Consciousness, I think, is the best book ever written on consciousness. I'm going to have to maybe talk loud to overcome the chainsaw massacre. But there's a quote that Jeffrey Gray tries to cover the idea of responsibility. I wanted to read a quote to you. He says, responsibility has to do with the correct functioning of the feedback systems that control an individual's interactions with environmental rewards and punishments. These operate largely unconsciously. The conscious recognition of a decision to act and the ensuing action is my decision and my action comes after the event, but they nonetheless are mine, save for the relatively rare case of illusion or experimental manipulation. Responsibility for instrumental behavior lies with the entire system that is, scare quotes, me. It's unconscious as much as its conscious part. So this is my question based on Jeffrey's way of thinking, which I tend to agree. What's wrong with the way we do things legally, which is to say that if your brain is capable of learning from reward and punishment in a way that falls within the typical range, then you, a physical organism and cybernetic system, not a magical dualistic soul, I give you that, are responsible for your actions, and punishment might retrain you and influence your future behavior. Whereas if your brain is, quote, messed up in such a way that you can't learn in a reliable manner, such as you cover schizophrenia in your book, then say you're not responsible. What's wrong with punishment as a tool for learning for the guilty individual and deterrence for everyone else?
It's perfectly great. It's a good instrumental tool. We like using it way too much and for all sorts of wrong reasons. But if it's just being used in an instrumental way, that's one of a gazillion things in your armamentarium or whatever. But I think you made a critical line in the sand dichotomy there, dualism, when you said within the normal range, which is, I think, in many ways, the most reasonable compatibilist approach, which is to say, okay, we recognize there's some edge cases. If the person shows up and they have an IQ of 60, all bets are off. We're going to run the legal system differently with them. And if somebody shows up and they're 7'4", all bets are off on how we assess their basketball skills, because the edge cases, remember, be nice to the kid with dyslexia. It's not their fault that they're not learning how to read. But that's where
you're saying, so you're saying, Scott, that if you're in the normal range, then it's not, that somehow the rules apply differently. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, or at least I can see it through your head of how that must have sounded. But if the normal learning mechanisms are in place, to me that is an important chain in that causal thing that is that is causing a change in the world. Learning from your mistakes in the past. Yes, you can. If you can't, my friend Sam Harris, is obsessed with the rewind the tape. It's like he can't think of free will as anything else but if you rewind the tape, you can't do differently. But I'm saying, what about the future? Humans care not just about a magical time machine that we're not going to have in our lifetimes, but people, I take a cybernetic free will perspective, and that's just my perspective, and I contrast that from the magical free will. So I give you that you made a great compelling case in your book why a lot of people, including a large chunk of compatibilists, need to give that up. But I also think that what humans care about when they care about free will are the kind of cybernetic mechanisms of goal attainment, being able to make changes to your subconscious system through conscious effort or intentionality. I know you don't believe that's a thing, but my whole research background is through Herb Simon, at Carnegie Mellon, and the whole I was trained from day one to learn about means ends analysis, and the cybernetic perspectives. So don't you think that cybernetic free will is a free will worth wanting? That's all I'm arguing here.
Absolutely, it would be gret.
Okay.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. You might be great if it existed.
The second you can show the feedback loops of phosphorylation pathways in your amygdala and every other aspect with which you can explain why somebody who has gone through sexual assault forever after, without consciously even realizing it, their heart will beat faster when they're in a space that in some way resembles that. We've just shown that the notion of us consciously being part of the feedback loops in the cybernetics, most of the time, all of the time, even once in a millennium, but all the time, are not really there. I mean, the second you get someone like Jonathan Haidt, and he sticks you in a brain scanner, and you're making a moral decision about some like thought experiment, and you can tell what the person is going to decide by looking at their limbic system's activity before you can tell by looking at their frontal cortex. The frontal cortex isn't thinking and choosing. It's doing a post hoc rationalization. When you can actually, like in real time, show, look, the amygdala activated before the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex did. There's no choice going on there. It was post hoc stuff. But what I think you're emphasizing is this incredibly like emotionally important thing, which is it's great if we can explain the past. And here's why, like, what happened to Hitler when he was still in diapers, that explain everything, and why, Alexander the Great screwed up after a while, or if you want to be Jared Diamond. But what we really want to do is, as you said, predict the future.
That's what brains are good at.
Yes.
Brains, most brains.
But where you get into trouble was exactly like the punchline in my couple of chapters there, like chaoticism and stuff. There are a whole lot of things that are unpredictable, but are still deterministic. And we've got this huge cognitive bias to decide that if it was unpredictable, some sort of magic happened. If there's no way to tell if A or B caused this, and it's not just because you don't have the good enough of like instruments but it is fundamentally, by the nature of the universe, impossible to tell if A or B caused this to happen. Maybe nothing caused that to happen. If it could have happened without A and it could have happened without B, maybe it could have happened without both of them and it just happened. And that's mistaking unpredictability for determinism. I mean, that was like the legal system got past that in the 1920s. I make reference to this famous law case where two people, separate people, did something negligent and both of them started fires that got out of control. And the fires happened to converge together and burn down somebody's house. And the court at that time was the very first one that said, you can't get away with the lawyer for firemaker A saying, hey, the house would have burned down even if my guy didn't do it. While lawyer B is saying, hey, the house wouldn't have burned down, saying, you can't get away with that. Just because we didn't know which ember was most responsible. There was causality there, even if there wasn't predictability. And the legal system, like officially, like a case name that law students have to memorize, sorted that one out in the 1920s, but they framed it as statistical guilt. You can have like...
That's actually really interesting. Yeah.
And that's kind of how they approached it. It can't be that every single person in the firing squad can say, if I hadn't shot my gun, they would still be dead. So I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything. What I think is more fundamental for us is, instead of framing it as there can be such a thing as statistical guilt, that there can be such a thing as things that are utterly, implicitly unpredictable and never will be, but they're still made out of stuff. And stuff that operates with the same rules as the rest of the world. And I think that's where, okay, show me we can predict now. And if you can't, it's because there's some magic dust somewhere along the way.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Unlikely Collaborators. Their mission is to untangle the stories that hold us back as individuals, communities, nations, and humanity at large. Using the perception box lens, they do this through storytelling, experiences, impact, investments, and scientific research. Today's conversation with Robert really illustrates the importance of expanding the walls of our perception box. The perception box is the invisible mental box that we all live inside, and it can seriously hinder our ability to understand one another and to understand ourselves. In this episode, Robert sticks to a very specific definition of free will, arguing that we don't have free will because there is no human thought, feeling, or action that is not caused by the accumulation of biological and environmental luck, over which he argues we have no control. But regardless of your own definition of free will, from a perception box perspective, the perception that we have real agency can significantly impact our sense of hope and our ability to reach our goals. Our perception of agency really does matter a great deal, especially in terms of how we respond to how we're feeling inside. It's that response that can greatly expand our perception box and also allow us to see new possibilities for our lives moving forward, despite our past. To find out more about Unlikely Collaborators and the perception box, go to unlikelycollaborators.com. Hey man, I'm glad that you took on the project of showing how silly the magic free will idea is. So I am really glad, but it's just interesting because you go one by one and you say, well, and then you acknowledge for each example, you're like, yes, I acknowledge that even this doesn't 100% explain, but then you're kind of like, but if you add it all up, it can't be, but that's not this equivalent of proof that.
No, and it's not just adding it all up. Look how many balls I'm juggling in the air. It's that whole point that it's all ultimately exactly one seamless continuum of biology interacting with environment, whatever. There's still no proof, but it's at that point that I become like my most infuriating pain in the ass in the book by doing something where, like the low rent version of it, philosophers already say that's ridiculous. And I multiply it a zillionfold. Somebody's just done something very consequential. They've behaved, they've pulled a trigger. And like you can identify, here's the 4.5 motor neurons that told those muscles to, extend or contract or whatever. And like this philosopher, Alfred Mealy, stops after the first step of saying, okay, show me that those 4 neurons would have done the same exact thing no matter what else all the other neurons in the brain were doing. And he at that point says, that's ridiculous, that's unfair, that's too high of a bar. My view is that isn't even the first baby step, because you got to show those neurons would have done the exact same thing no matter whether that person was sleepy, happy, hungry, tired, or whatever in the minutes before, and no matter what their hormone levels were that morning, and no matter what the previous 4 months had done to their amygdala or hippocampus, and no matter, all the way back to, and no matter if we had evolved to be a more polygamous species than we are, or a more monogamous one, because like whatever the savannah was feeding us back when, show me that every single one of those things could be dramatically different, and those 4 neurons still would have done exactly what they did. And that's it. You've proven free will. You have just shown a spectacularly convincing case of something being a causeless cause. And you can't do it.
I get where the thing is stuck here is that it's just you're not. Are you willing to entertain there might be other definitions of free will that might be equally valid from the human eye perspective?
Yeah, but pain in the ass now. But they're wrong. Because
humans are, the organism experiencing the world, has its own sort of, I just think that the uncaused cause, it's because I agree with you, but I think that confuses the everyday human that's searching for free will, because I think we do have built into the machinery of the human genome, human brains, the way that the things that make us different than rats, we have a lot, not as much as we think we have. So I'm with you there, and I'm with a lot of determinists there, but we have something that allows us, even through like mindful. This is what's so interesting. I had a 4-hour debate with Sam Harris on my podcast about very similar issues. You and him must be friends or something. You guys have similar ideas.
We have different styles, I think, but
maybe different styles, but similar.
Yeah, I basically agree with everything he has ever said or thought in his life until it comes to like Islam. But anyway, that's a whole other story.
And that's a whole other can of worms. But sticking with the idea of free will, it just seems like his whole project of trying to help people practice mindfulness meditation and to be more mindful about your choices and create more of a separation of space between your gut feeling and the way that you act on it in the world. To me, that is a uniquely human capacity that gives us a certain form of free will worth wanting. Do you disagree with that? Do you not see that? I know how you define free will, but I'm saying you open to expanding your definition of free will beyond how you currently define it.
No, because expanding it, just to get back to, the outcome of all our genes and evolution, all of that is this sense of agency. Not expanding it because the science is of why we believe and have such a strong emotional need to believe in free will, because the alternative is unpalatable as hell. But okay, so back to meditation. Let's break that down into make it mechanistic. And okay, so you by breathing in deeply and exhaling slowly, you stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. And as a result, your vagal nerve makes your locus coeruleus be less aroused. And as a result, your amygdala is silenced by GABAergic interneurons and you secrete less glucocorticoids. And if you do that a lot, all the relevant synapses will show plasticity. So that could become a much more effective everyday sort of thing. Okay, that's great, because at the bottom of that barrel is you chose to start meditating, or deep breathing. But that's exactly where you've just looked at the whole film with the last 3 minutes, because you look at two people who have both decided to do that because, like, the doc told them their blood pressure is getting too high and their family says they're too irritable. And they both decide they should do this because they've read it works and all of that. And it just doesn't work for one of them because they can't relax. Why is it they can't relax? Because their genetics plus whatever, plus early environment, makes for a default mode network that's a little bit too hyperactive for their frontal cortex to tell it, stop thinking about the rent, stop thinking about the bills you need to pay, and just focus on your breathing. Or because two people are both equally in need of that and only one of them does it because the other one has no respect for reading and has never read about it, or grew up in a way where they hated their parents and they hated their teachers, and they, as a result, are ornery by choice against anyone who's telling them anything that supposedly is good for them. So screw that. It's at every step of the way. You don't just need to explain how it is the person decided, I want to start doing deep breathing and mindfulness because this is a much better way than taking beta blockers or something. You need to explain how they found out about that. Why'd they learn how to read? Not everyone gets that luck. Why do they believe what they read? Why is it that they were capable of extrapolating from this worked for the Dalai Lama to doing this extrapolative sort of speculative predicting the future kind of thing of, whoa, maybe it'll work for me? Where'd they get that sense of efficacy? Maybe they're depressed as hell and they say, this could never possibly work for me because they're learned helpless. Okay, where'd that come from? Why don't they wind up having lower blood pressure from mindfulness breathing? Because their serotonin transporter and their trauma and childhood and all of that made them depression prone, and they're less likely to say, wow, I'm going to do that too because that's going to work. Because their proclivity is, nah, I'm a screw up, or I will be able to be disciplined enough, or where'd that choice come from?
Yeah, look, I'm with you. You keep explaining to me why there's no magical free will, and you don't have to convince me of that. You don't have to convince me of that.
There's also no logical free will if you don't allow yourself to stop at I decided to do that. I intended to do that.
But you have this tendency to break something very complex, down into its most atomic parts. And I think, it's an interesting question, when we talk about human qualia, right? How are you going to break that down for me? The emergent property of what it means to be human, that experience. Yes, you could start going and describing to me all the constituent biological parts, but there is an emergence of the biological organism of the experience of being human. That level of analysis just doesn't really, it's not satisfactory to the organism experiencing the whole gestalt.
Except every now and then, one of those little biological constituent parts is not so little. Why did this person do this? Whoa, we just found out that they underwent the biological phenomenon of being shuttled from foster home to foster home when they were 8 years old and sexually abused in the process. And if you want to reframe the world in my narrow vocabulary, that was a biological process because it epigenetically screwed up the. And that's why they just robbed the liquor store, and you growing up with piano lessons in the suburbs did not.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a very good reason to show more compassion to even very angry people, or people that we're supposed to be primed to dislike, and I think that you make a very good case for why we could use a lot more compassion for each other. So yeah, again, you don't have to convince me that we don't have magical free will. I guess I'm trying to find a way into this where I suppose the kind of agency I describe, you just simply would not, there's no universe in which you're going to conceptualize that as a free will worth wanting. And I think maybe that's just I need to accept that.
Where it's getting there at the last minute, because we've constructed a world where we are willing to judge and punish and reward people based on what they did in the last 3 minutes. Wow, you helped the old lady cross the street. Wow, you pulled the trigger. And we're perfectly happy to run society on that and make people undergo punishment or reward for things they're not responsible for. I mean, in terms of edge cases, we've gotten to the point of we can figure out, that hurricane probably wasn't caused by an old toothless woman who lives by herself, and thus we decide that she's a witch. And we've decided what seemed intuitively just obvious 300 years ago, which
what
is
the heck? What is that? What in the world? What in the world?
That's our National Geographic clock. On the hour, it makes a different animal sound, except years ago we dropped it. And thus, when it's like the flamingos, we hear the lion roaring, and we totally screwed up our kids' zoology sense. But we have to deal with the fact that 300 years ago, people just as smart as us and just as compassionate and just as willing to say, nonetheless, this is the nature of the world, had a very high chance of saying it's okay for 4-year-olds to be worked to death in factories, or some people are meant for slavery, and in fact, you're doing them a favor by doing it because they couldn't take care of themselves. And we now know 300 years later that isn't the case. And we just have a completely different set of intuitions right now. If somebody skips the partying in the dorm and studies all night, and as a result, they've got a better GPA than everybody else, we haven't reached the slavery doesn't make sense state of saying there's a reason why some people party all night and some people, and that's great. Let this guy be more likely to become a doctor at the other end of it after they graduate, but they didn't earn it. They're not more deserving of their high or low GPA.
Yeah, and that's a super interesting argument, considering my earlier work on redefining intelligence beyond IQ and the kind of structures we have for gifted education and giving certain people access and other people not having access. So I think that's a really interesting and quite valid point. I'm trying to think of specific examples to give you, just because I really want to see the way you see the world is what I really want to do here. So
the
that
way
I make sure, yeah.
Again, emphasizing the way I manage with a great deal of effort to see the world about 1% of the time.
Yeah.
Again,
fair enough.
This isn't
Fair
easy.
Enough. So I'm thinking about the case of, a person goes on autopilot for most of their addiction. Let's say they're addicted to alcohol, and they feel like one day they just woke up and they're like, you know what? Let's say they reached rock bottom, and they're like, yes, all these things in my causal chain have led to the moment of me hitting rock bottom, but I am making this choice to take the very long, strenuous. It's not that the decision they're making in this moment causes a magical change, but it sets off a chain of events that for years to come. It might take years before they get to a point where they feel happier about where they are with their relationship with this addiction. So these processes can take a long time, but don't you certainly you would agree there are these conscious processes and top down approaches that can influence the bottom up aspects. But I suppose you just can't conceptualize that as a type of free will. Is that right?
A type of free will that has occurred independent of all those other influences and has the unprovable capacity to reach down and change the very nature of those component
Have
parts.
some capacity. Yeah, well, it seems to me like it does have some capacity to influence, not completely, but there is, you make a very strong argument in your book about there being zero. I don't view it as all or nothing. I view free will as a continuum, and I actually think that there's a big difference between the free will that a comatose patient has, the free will that a non-comatose patient, the free will that someone who has a full set of, like a psychopath, that this is a mutual interest of both of ours, the neuroscience of psychopaths. I think they have less free will, I would argue, in a lot of ways, because their systems for learning about reward and punishment is altered than from someone else. And I think that influences the free will that humans care about.
But again, we're at that point.
The definitions.
And if at the end of the day, it's okay, you want to believe in free will and you're going to find it to be too depressing otherwise or whatever, be happy. Your mother and I just want you to do okay in life. So you could believe in that. Most, if you have this very reductive sort of definition, a very large percentage of Earth's misery is caused by our belief that people should be held responsible for things they were not responsible for. You really aren't a subhuman because you were born into this ethnic group that my culture has decided has no pain sensations for years and years, so it's okay for us to do an Armenian genocide. Or there's really not an explanation why, if you have felt lonely your whole life because you have an off-putting personality, like that's a whole other realm in which we run the world on the notion that type of pain is like logical, that the person in some way caused that, in some way is responsible. And maybe what we're getting to is like this, where I sort of try to get to at the end, which is if the notion that there's no free will like depresses the hell out of you, because, oh my God, I've got like an Ivy League affiliation and I worked damn hard. I could have like become a drug addict because like all sorts of friends from my upper middle class suburb wound up experimenting with ecstasy at some point. But I worked incredibly hard. Or like, do you have any idea how many hours of sleep deprivation I had to endure to become a cardiothoracic surgeon? Or to like remember the homeless aren't, they count too, and to do something nice for them. Like, if those are the things that you feel bummed out about, if there's no free will, by definition, you're one of the lucky ones, because what you are facing is the possibility that you did not really earn the things for which you have been rewarded and privileged and gifted. But for most people, what life is about is it's a world run on myths of this being just, and the pains in your life are due to the fact that you wound up having the wrong variant of this gene, or your face wasn't symmetrical enough, or you were too short, or you were too loud and raucous, or you were had too much body odor, or your makeup of NMDA glutamate receptors was some that you could never like get a good score on a standardized test. For most people, what you're explaining is it was bad luck. It's not because you have a shitty soul or you lack self-discipline. So in a sense, it's almost by definition, anyone who's going to go out and buy a book, a god-awful long book that's going on about minutia, and they're probably spending a substantial part of their life feeling rewarded for things that they had no control over, rather than feeling punished or despised or ignored for things they had no control over. So, like by definition, I'm writing for the wrong audience, because anyone
Yeah.
who would read this book is going to feel bummed out by the notion of it. And for most of humanity who aren't reading the book because, like, they have no running water and they're in the middle of South Sudan, uh, yeah, they're not going to find out. But for most people on Earth, responsibility is the incorrect attribution of things that justify unhappiness in life, and unhappiness that we are willing to hand out based on our belief that people had control over things that which they did not. That's most of the human experience.
Hey everyone, I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of my favorite products that helps support my body and mind as I age. On the Psychology Podcast, we frequently talk about forms of wisdom and self-actualization that are often achieved in our 30s and 40s, or even older. But it can be frustrating to finally know what you want out of life, just as you start to lose the mental and physical energy to go get it. A culprit of decreasing energy, slower workout recovery, and general middle-age symptoms that start showing up in our 30s is sentient cell accumulation. Sentient cells are sometimes called zombie cells because they're old, worn-out cells no longer doing their job in our bodies, but they linger on in us after we want them gone, wasting our energy and nutrition. Qualia Senolytic is an amazing formula made by Neurohacker Collective, a company I really trust. I've known the folks at Neurohacker Collective for years now, and they really are thoughtful about what they put into their products, always trying to be as science-informed as possible. Qualia Senolytic combines 9 vegan, non-GMO, plant-derived ingredients that help your body eliminate sentient cells. Personally, it helps me operate with the wisdom of a 40-something, with the mental and physical energy of a 20-something. The best part is you take Qualia Senolytic just 2 days a month. It's so easy and so helpful to the human aging process. To try Qualia Senolytic up to 50% off, backed by a 100-day money-back guarantee, go to neurohacker.com and use code PsychPodcast15 for an additional 15% off. That's Qualia Senolytic for better aging and prime energy deep into life at neurohacker.com/psychpodcast/psych15. This is so relevant to politics. You know, you have the left over here arguing that everything is the fault of the system, and then you have the right over here arguing that people need to take more responsibility for their actions. Both of them are just yelling at each other over both of these extreme perspectives. What is the implication of your view of free will for reconciling both of those perspectives?
Well, sweep them both out the door, and here
I
I'm
know.
being,
Yeah.
me and Sam Harris, we're like so far out on the lunatic fringe of this, as you keep coming back to, but none
Yeah.
whatsoever. Come on, none. It's the only possible logical extension if you take things to where it takes you. But where does this apply?
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that.
I
See,
know.
you say that so confidently.
I say it so
Yeah.
confidently because
Yeah.
it's true, and I can't function with it 99% of the time. So,
Okay.
like,
Okay.
I understand that, but what does this do to everything? The interesting thing is, not only does it make it seem like a totally radical thing, the criminal justice system makes no sense whatsoever and has to be totally gotten rid of. Fortunately, we could still run society in a way so the dangerous people aren't dangerous. We can keep them from being dangerous, but don't preach to them about how they have a terrible soul or temperament. Like, whoa, the whole criminal justice system needs to be thrown out. Equally so, the entire system of meritocracy has to be thrown out, because that makes as little sense. Yeah, make sure your neurosurgeon is like competent, that they've actually learned like how to do their thing. Like, keep us safe from murderers running around in the street, and keep us safe from neurosurgeons who were picked randomly, because after all, none of us deserve. Nonetheless, both make no sense whatsoever, and there's something terribly wrong if the end product of it is neurosurgeons, or any of the rest of us who would listen to something like this, feel like we have earned a higher consideration of our needs and well-being than any other person out there.
Yeah, there's a humbling spirit to what you're saying, and I like that. I do. I really like that spirit. I think that there's so many deep implications of this. The question of who is responsible for any outcome. Because usually no outcomes, just the causal factor is just one organism. So, you had me thinking earlier about this idea of statistical guilt. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't stop thinking about that because it's the first time I heard that phrase, but I think it's so interesting because there's some interesting research talking about in codependent relationships, whose fault is it? and the reality is that it's both their faults. I mean, faults,
Yes.
and even the word fault is interesting here, because what gets tricky is people say, don't victim blame. Don't victim blame by saying that the one victim, viewing the world as though there's always in every situation one victim and one perpetrator, as though like there can't be two perpetrators at the same time, as though there can't be two victims at the same, But
Yep.
the emergent sort of explanation, statistical guilt, I love that. I'm going to be using that a lot now, is that, the thing about statistical guilt is that's not victim blaming, right? But but it is being honest that there are it's a system of factors that have come together to predict 100% accuracy. If we were Lamarck's demon, predict that these two would be fighting in this relationship. but to say that it's entirely the husband's fault and 0%, it's like from this perspective, doesn't seem to it breaks down that sort of way of thinking, right?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
But what it also gets you to is it's not both of their faults. It's not both of and it's not both of the perpetrators' faults, and it's not the overachievers' wondrousness. Like it just hopscotches over all of this stuff because a lot of that is premised on the notion that we're trying to figure out a fair way of distributing responsibility. And sometimes it's yeah, I know.
This is tricky because the Republicans, they love to call people who don't succeed lazy, right? So the opposite end of taking credit is blaming the lack of achievement for laziness, right? And what you're saying, you can't have someone take credit for achieving, but you also can't have someone call them a loser because they didn't succeed.
And at the same time, like our nice stereotypical leftists are just as incorrect when they're saying, and this person who has just like spent 2 years volunteering for Doctors Without Borders has a tremendous capacity for empathy. That makes us it's good. It's good they turned out that way and do what's needed.
They can't take credit for having that empathy.
But they're not a better person or a worse person because of it. And they shouldn't have like a higher likelihood of having access to a vaccine that will stop a pandemic-caused virus. They didn't earn it.
It's so interesting. I really am trying very hard to see the world through your eyes, and think through the logical implications of it, because I think there's so much great grains, so much truth here. And I think about, but I'm not like 100% with you. I think about grit and your whole chapter on grit, and this is a trait I've studied with Angela Duckworth, and one big myth is that, well, IQ can't be changed, but grit can be changed much more than IQ. That one I tell people, what the hell are you talking about? Both grit and IQ have about the same heritability coefficient. I mean, there's no evidence suggesting that one of the traits is more malleable than the other. But they always say intelligence you can't change, but you could change. So I think we're in agreement on that pet peeve, right? But the thing, if I being this organism here decides to expend effort against what it wants to, it doesn't feel it, right? Like I wake up in the morning and I don't feel like going to the gym, but I fight against that motivation. And even if it's causing my organism pain to make it to the gym, I exert the effort, the time on task that makes me more likely that tomorrow I might be more likely actually to wake up being more motivated to go to the gym. See, I view that as an important form of human cybernetic free will, but I guess you don't.
Yeah, you can't take credit for why you have got a frontal cortex that's more self-disciplined than that of the person next to you, because it had something to do starting with like your mother's socioeconomic status when you were a fetus. That's not a big explanatory part of it, but all of it together, you didn't choose to have a frontal cortex that's better at ignoring dopaminergic anticipatory stuff, saying, let's go do something fun instead.
But you don't think
In a
you can't
sense,
give complete credit. You can't give like an A+ credit for it. I agree. But you saying zero. So there's like no credit you're willing to give that organism for deciding to overcome its inertia in that moment to put you on a better path for self-development in the future. See, you don't. I would give credit to an organism for doing that. I probably would.
but would you thus blame an organism that decides to do that and can't pull it off? Would you decide they weren't
That's
serious?
controversial.
They don't have self-discipline. It's the same thing. You framed, oh, it's false dichotomy between like emotional intelligence and IQ or
IQ
empathy
and grit,
or
IQ and
grit
grit.
or and yeah,
Yeah.
and you can show that in terms of heritability stuff. I would take sort of a larger way of saying the exact same thing. Grit and self-discipline or lack of and all of that is made out of the same stuff as the rest of the universe, is made out of the same stuff as why you're faster at answering questions on Jeopardy than the next person. It's made of the same, like, it's not fairy dust. It's made of atoms, and it's the same pathways that not only give us better or worse natural attributes, it's the same pathways that then determine whether we take advantage of them or squander them or like never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity or get our nose to the grind. It's the same stuff.
Yeah. I really hope we're not talking past each other, because I find myself listening to you and I find myself listening to you and agreeing with you, and then making a point that disagrees with you.
Yes.
but I actually agree with what you're saying. You know, our actions have consequences on the world, obviously. Okay. And our thoughts don't necessarily have direct consequences on the world. Some people have argued that our free will is in that free won't, is in that, you know, our ability to inhibit our impulses, and some of that is, we have some uniquely human capacities for that kind of putting the brakes on. You know, lions don't seem to have as good of a capacity to put the brakes on as some humans. Some humans are worse than some lions. But anyway,
But we really
yeah.
don't want to understand why we're less likely to predate the old woman crossing the street than would a lion. We're not interested in like why we think and redwood trees and crabgrass don't. We're trying to make sense within species, and that forces us back into this realm.
Yeah, I think that's what affords us by viewing free will as a continuum, you know, and being able and giving people the hope and optimism that they can make changes in their lives that fundamentally change their agency in ways that give us a free will with wanting that the organism cares about. But I guess you don't see it that way.
No, and like, I'm going to get off this, and my wife is going to say, how was it? And I was going to say, oh, it was a total blast, totally fun guy to talk with. And as a result of that, if I know that you're in the car that's trying to merge in the lane in front of me 3.5 years from now, I'm more likely to let you merge in. And if we went on a mammoth hunt together, I would like make sure you got the best piece first, because, wow, totally fun talking with this guy. He was great. But you don't deserve to get to merge in more than anybody else or get the bigger piece of mammoth meat. It's not by chance that you wound up this way, and it's not by chance that I wound up valuing you being this way. And like, it's just down from there.
I think there's something really fundamentally gets really emotional about this that I want to take out of it, because, you know, so my personal history, which is really quick, like no one believed in my potential for anything when I was a kid. I was in special education for a learning disability in auditory, and they all thought I was dumb. And I decided, again, and you were rethinking the word decide here today, but I decided in 9th grade that I didn't want to be a victim of the system anymore, that I didn't want people to just view me as one-dimensional through my lens of my learning disability. And I really made a lot of efforts to take myself out of special education, learn. I studied extra hard. Like, maybe I was not gifted with the genetic genes that make learning easy, but I really put in a lot of effort to learn better. Now, so it's an interesting question. To this day, do I take, yeah, because I do, like, obviously, I'm like, yeah, I take some credit for, and it's called the hero's journey, right? But you're kind of smacking down the hero's journey. You're saying, you're like taking the hero's journey and you're saying, stop it.
Exactly.
You had no free will in even constructing that narrative.
Yes. And
I know what you're saying.
It's a bummer for you because when you decided, it worked. And it's not not a bummer for somebody where you explain why it is that even though they decided and they knew this is my only hope for a happier life, it didn't work. They're not less deserving than you of consideration or any of that. And like, just as one of with those 4 neurons have done the exact same thing, if you had by sheer random luck been raised in, I don't know, Tehran or so with parents who were Ayatollahs, they would have said, this is your fate because you have a bad soul or you were cursed with this inability to learn how to read well because you did something terribly. Or I don't know, if you're born in the middle of Biloxi, Mississippi, you could very readily have parents who have that same attributional system. And you would never have said, hey, I'm going to start trying to pay attention more. And before you know it, I'm going to have a podcast someday. Just that one thing, your neurons would have done something different 3.5 minutes ago.
Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for what you're saying. I like that. Look, I like the spirit of what you just said. But I also think that there's a certain free will in us trying to help people who don't have those advantages. I mean, there's a reason why I wrote this book supporting creative students with learning difficulties, because there's science showing that there's things we can do to take people who have had unfortunate circumstances and give them greater opportunities to be in a position to have the free will worth wanting, is what I'm saying. But I guess you just don't see it that way. And part of me today is just wanting to really understand the way you see the world so that I can see what I think. What do I even think? I'm open to changing my thoughts, Well, I guess I have no choice in that matter, according to you, but
I mean, like one of my heroes, Wilma Rudolph in 1960 was the fastest human woman alive, and she got umpteen gold medals. And she's like, and she grew up as one of 22 children of a sharecropper in Tennessee and had polio. She was in leg braces until she decided at some point in adolescence that I'm going to overcome this. And she's the fastest woman. Oh my God, I so admire her. And that is so wrong. It's a good thing, though, if in part, as a result of admiring her, I internalize and say, wow, maybe I can be more accomplished or show more discipline. It's a crappy thing if I decide that thus she is more deserving of being left on the lifeboat than somebody else.
Yeah. And that's your merit. So what's the alternative to meritocracy as you see it?
Let competent people do the things that require their sort of competence. Let dangerous people be in a position where they can't be dangerous. But it shouldn't be all that different from if your kid is sneezing a lot, keep them home from kindergarten that day. They can still play with their toys and you still tell them you love them to bits. They're just sneezing. So let's make sure that they can't damage the world with their sneezing propensities and try to deal with this sneezing wave that's ruining society by getting tough on sneezers. It protect us from stuff, have competent people doing the things we need to have done competently. And maybe if you really need to motivate them, it's okay for you to say, good job, nice going, or maybe give them a better salary than everyone else, or resources to do more of what it is that they're good at, but not because they earned to have their needs be more worthy of consideration than that of any other human.
I like that.
And
I like that.
And that's the only possible outcome. And I can't do it. I can't think that way almost all the time. So yeah, it seems totally crazy and impossible, but it's got to be.
I remember you gave a talk at the Learning in Brain, or no, not Learning in Brain. There was some education conference I'm blanking on. We have a picture together. I can send it to you. We took. And I was like, I came up to you. I was like, I'm such a big fan of yours. So I realized that we have similar views about education. So could it be that one of the implications of this is moving away? You said meritocracy, but also I would just say such a standardized testing obsessed culture, where we reward with, the ability to get entrance into universities, to be able to get jobs, how they performed on these tests, which there is a substantial genetic component to. We've published data on this, on the predicting the G factor of standardized achievement test scores, and that's controversial to say that in some circles, but it's relevant to this conversation. I've argued for more of a self-actualization focused education system, where we really honor the sacredness of each individual child's journey, And I guess you would just say that journey is not freely chosen, and maybe that's just like almost irrelevant then to the practical thing. But I think we probably both agree on the free will thing aside, that we need a major shift in our education system.
Yeah, and not just recognizing that two people get different SAT scores, and it's got something to do with their genes over which they had no control, but just as documentably, it has something to do with the fact that they grew up in a neighborhood with far, far more liquor stores than grocery stores that sold fresh food. That's a pretty gatebreak predictor of someone who's going to be antisocial in some of their behaviors by the time they're 20. Yeah, all of that stuff.
So if you take two people, take two kids, one has a knack for learning. It comes very easy, and they never have to do their homework ever. Very, very rarely do they need to read the book, and they ace all the tests. You take child two, who struggles so much, but decides they're going to put in 50 times the effort, etc. You would say that child two does not deserve any more credit than child one, is what you would argue, right?
Even though every itch of our instinct says exactly to do. Yeah. We're educators, and the one who works their way up, and Horatio Alger, and pull yourself up on your bootstraps. Mm-hmm. That's the most egregiously illogical thing I do in my sleep. Because
if that child is their organism, though, I feel like the organism can take. I guess the question is, what does it mean to take credit for something? You can't say that that was that other organism that did it. Certainly, it is this organism that did it. So in one sense, you can take credit, but in another sense, you shouldn't take too much credit.
Yeah, it's like that great John Searles quote that I have somewhere in the book, Berkeley Philosopher, where he says, so what am I supposed to do? I go into a restaurant and the waiter comes up and wants me to order. And I say, well, I'm a determinist, so I'm just going to lean back and see what I order. It can't work that way. It's inseparable.
And you're not a fatalist. You're not a fatalist.
No, because that's the two biggest things is, effort and tenacity or lack thereof is a different flavor of thing than your natural attributes. And the other one is, if we have no free will, that means everything is nothing can change.
Nothing can change.
And it's anything that, and when you look at the mechanisms by which change happens, by which someone who was a whatever and is now an ex-white supremacist or whatever, or any it's the same. It's a mechanistic explanation.
Beautiful. I'll end here today. Even though we have quibbles on definitions of what we want to include under free will, I'll read a tweet that I wrote a couple years ago that even Sam Harris agreed with, and I feel like you're. I think we'll both end on this agreement. Well, I could be wrong. Even though we probably don't have ultimate free will, and that's really what your book tackles, in my opinion, is ultimate free will. We have witness consciousness. You literally have a front row seat to the unfolding of your life story. That's reason enough to stick around. Your life story is sure to have twists and turns you could never have predicted. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And so that's one reason to stick around and to enjoy the preciousness of human existence.
Because no matter how much we're made out of atoms, the right kind of music is still like the greatest thing ever.
And you can't take that human experience away from us. It's still transcendent experiences make life worth living in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Thank you, Robert, so much for being my podcast. This is a sign of respect for you that I asked you so many challenging questions, because I usually am not disengaged. I'm usually not disengaged with my guests. So I have such deep respect for you. That's what this shows.
That's great. Well, this has been a total blast. Any time you want to arm wrestle some more, this was
sounds good.
This was fun. Thanks.
I love it. Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.